It's a pleasure to introduce again Laurie Zoloth. She's already spoken to us, but just to remind you, Laurie is Professor of Bioethics and Humanities at Feinberg School of Medicine, Professor of Religion, and a member of Jewish Studies faculty at Weinberg College of Arts and Science. And she has wide experience serving on panels and boards over questions of bioethics. And her talk this morning is on religion, suffering, and bioethics.
So we've heard a wonderful talk with a lot of numbers. And I love science, and I love quantitative research. This is a whole other thing. We're going to start with a story. It's been a long, lovely week, and I thought we'd start and end with a story, because that's how Jews think through difficult ethical questions, through narrative. And this story comes from the Babylonian Talmud that Daniel introduced you to yesterday. There is two communities at the time of the writing. They're both under Roman oppression. They're powerless. And there's a community in Babylon and a community in Palestine. And this text, this story that you have before you, I'm going to read it, and you can read along with me. It's a long, complex story about suffering by men who are suffering, about their condition both personally and politically. And this is a hard text, by the way, but you're really smart. Now, I know this. I've spent a week with you. You're really smart. And so this is not little like aphorisms from the Talmud. This is a serious discourse. Okay, so you with me? You want to do this? Yes, a story? Yes. Serious story? Religion for grown-ups, as they say. So let us begin in a Jewish sort of way by considering a story. And this is from Barachot 5b, the Talmudic page. It has been taught. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, "The Holy One, blessed be He, gave Israel 3 precious gifts, and all of them were given only through suffering. These are the Torah, the land of Israel, and the world to come." Whence do we know of this Torah? Someone interrupts. Someone else says, "Because it is said, happy is the man who thou chastenest, O Lord, and teachest out of thy law." What about the land of Israel? Because it said, someone says, "As a man chastised his son, so the Lord thy God chastised thee." And after it is written that, "For the Lord thy God brought thee into a good land." What about the world to come? Because someone says, it's written, "For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is light, and the reproofs of suffering are the way of life." Notice the back and forth dialogue. You're in a room with people arguing, Jews. A Tana recited before Rabbi Yohanan the following: "If a man busies himself in the study of the Torah and acts of charity, and nonetheless buries his children, all of his sins are forgiven him." Rabbi Yohanan said to him, "I grant you Torah and acts of charity, for it is written, by mercy and truth inequity is expiated. Mercy is acts of charity, for it is said, he that follows after righteousness and mercy finds life, prosperity, and honor. Truth is Torah, for it is said, buy the truth and sell it not. But how do you know? What do you say about the one who buries his children?" A certain elder then recited to him in the name of Simeon ben Yochai. It is concluded from the analogy and the use of the word inequity. Here it is written, by mercy and truth inequity is expiated. And elsewhere in the Torah it is written, and who recompensates the inequity of the fathers into the bosom of their children. Notice the word game that they're playing. Rabbi Yohanan says, leprosy and the lack of children are not chastisements of love. But is leprosy not a chastisement of love, somebody else says? Is it not taught if a man has one of these 4 symptoms of leprosy, it is nothing else but an altar of atonement? Someone else says, they're an altar of atonement, but they are not chastisements of love. If you like, says someone, I can say, that teaching is ours in Babylonia, and that teaching, but Rabbi Yohanan said, is theirs in Palestine. If you like, I can say, this teaching refers to what is hidden, like leprosy, and what Rabbi Yohanan says refers to a case of visible leprosy. But is the lack of children not a chastisement of love? How is this to be understood? Shall I say that he had children and they died? Did not Rabbi Yohanan himself say, this is the bone of my 10th son? Rather say then that the former saying refers to one who never had children and thus doesn't understand, and the latter to one who had children and lost them. Rabbi Hiya ben Abba fell ill, and Rabbi Yohanan went in to visit him. He said to him, are your sufferings welcome to you? And Abba said, neither they nor their reward. Yohanan said to me, give me your hand. And Abba gave him his hand, and Yohanan raised him. Then Rabbi Yohanan once fell ill, and Rabbi Hanina went in to visit him. And he said to Yohanan, "Are your sufferings welcome to you?" And Yohanan replied, "Neither they nor their reward." And Hanina said to Yohanan, "Give me your hand." And he gave him his hand, and he raised him. "Why could not Rabbi Yohanan raise himself?" They replied, "The prisoner cannot free himself from jail." Then Rabbi Eliezer fell ill, and Rabbi Yohanan went to visit him. He noticed that he was lying in a dark room, and he bared his arm, and light radiated from his arm. Then he noticed that Rabbi Eliezer was weeping. And Yohanan said to him, "Eliezer, why do you weep? Is it because you did not study enough Torah? Surely we learned the one who sacrifices much and the one who sacrifices little have the same merit, providing the heart is directed to heaven. Is it perhaps lack of sustenance? Not everybody has the privilege to enjoy two tables. Is it because of the lack of children?" And he pulls out of his pocket and says, "This is the bone of my 10th son." He replied to him, "I am weeping on account of this beauty that is going to rot in the earth." He said to him, "On that account, you surely have a reason to weep." And then they both wept. In the meanwhile, he said to him, "Are your sufferings welcome to you?" And he replied, "Neither they, nor their reward." And he said to him, "Give me your hand." And he gave him his hand, and he raised him. Take a minute, think about that. What I'm going to read you now, we'll get back to the explanation, is selections from a longer piece that you'll find in your wonderful resource website. In a long passage in the Babylonian Talmud, the rabbinic authorities debate the matter of suffering and its meaning. Is there value in suffering? Do you welcome them or their reward? Can suffering act as atonement for sinful behavior? Can the suffering one at the least understand his agony as an expiation? The answer that you just read in the text is a very long and complex argument in which the protagonists, experiencing terrible loss and terrible illness, repeat to one another, "Are your sufferings welcome to you?" And he replied, "Neither they nor their reward." Now I'm going to get back to this text in some detail in a minute. But a text like this notes the complexities of this tradition, raises questions within the narrative, telling us, you, the readers, that suffering in normal rabbinic Judaism is not here welcomed as meaningful. It's not a learning experience. It's not a threshold to a post-mortem reward, nor is it an exchange of goodness for grace, and it's not the event that shapes our humanity. How unlike one is immediately moved to consider this view of suffering from other religious traditions. How unlike so many constructions of faith within contemporary discourse, most especially, I think, in the discourse of bioethics. On the personal level, in such a text, pain and grief and illness and befallenness are just understood as chaos, as disorder, which is largely without spiritual value at all. It's useless. It's not linked to a spiritual journey or holy transformation, and that's important. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the core differences in this text and in our tradition, Judaism, and which I argue has come to define and delineate one of the most central issues in contemporary bioethics, the way that human suffering and its tragic or redemptive nature is at stake in debates as varied as stem cell research, end-of-life care, or reproductive policy. Bioethics is not the only venue in which the view of suffering animates the policy discussion. It is a quiet and steady presence behind much political and social discourse, I think. Behind the passion of those debates and the logic of their argument live core belief structures of religion, animated by substantially different traditions. Perhaps nowhere are these differences more deeply shaped as in the policy in medicine and medical research, but I could argue, I think, that the whole public debate about worth, about harm, about human rights, rests on the fulcrum of meaning of suffering in human life and our responsibility to the suffering of the other. And I want to sketch out a few outlines, not a whole piece, not the entire Jewish view, of course, but it's sort of how the view is debated in this one text, and how even within the one text you can hear the different voices that Judaism brings to one another and to the larger world of bioethics. There's another critical difference, obviously, about suffering that is carried by the Jewish tradition in contemporary bioethics, perhaps most especially as a reality because of the Shoah, the Holocaust. Jews have both an individual body and a corporate body, and an individual fate and a corporate fate. So the question of suffering is always about the ontological individual Jew who lives at a particular place and time, but also about the narrative and the suffering of the Jewish people as a whole, which is timeless and placeless. For while it's been a question since the destruction of the Second Temple of why the Jewish people suffer, it's intensified to blinding speed after the Second World War, in which the entire project of European Jewry, the elegant and intricate life of 6 million men and women and children, from the voices rising in the Grand Synagogue of Berlin to the small breath of a waiting boy in a village kitchen, was utterly and irrevocably obliterated. Suffering with a Jewish bioethicist always has this first person and third person grammar, a single tone in multiple registers. So let me just state the obvious. The Christian narrative is based on a cluster of traditions in which the individual person exists in a world that has been redeemed and forgiven by the central sacrifice of Jesus, who is crucified as atonement of collective human sin. Did I get that right? Fair enough? Good. This link between embodied corporal suffering and atonement for sin offers a strong mimetic for any individual Christian in physical pain. Texts of Christian bioethics often stress this link, suggesting that it's our capacity for suffering that makes us both most fully human and capable of transcendence. The cross, then, is the center of history for Christians, and the problem of suffering is a central issue for most religions. It's true, of course, that in this particular world, in this religious cosmology, it is created in such a way, that our colleague from Malta reminded us, that tragic events will happen. And the rabbinic editor that edited this text wrote that links the textual accounts of debates about suffering, but at the same time he's writing, or they're speaking, under conditions of serious and collective suffering during the height of Roman imperial power. And later the text is reread over and over in the long night of diasporic exile. But suffering in this text does not purify, and it does not redeem the world. Suffering in these texts creates a crisis, an injustice, a rupture, and the possibility of repair. If it can't be righted, this suffering, it can only be witnessed by another. It's that occasion of tragedy. But most important, one is not elevated by the suffering of the other. The Jewish understanding runs counter to that. It runs towards protest, towards healing, towards repair. So suffering within most, though not all, normative Jewish texts in the rabbinic period is not a problem of being. It is a problem of ethics. It's a problem of how to respond to both, first for three reasons. First, because the way that the moral gesture of medicine is the primary response to personal human suffering, as you saw in the text and in bioethics, right? They were suddenly in bed, sick, back and forth. Second, because the primary act of healing involves not only the direct encounter with the other on the physical and body level, they're sick, but it's a direct encounter with the other at the moral and existential level, meaning that a healer has to be willing to participate in the act of moral repair and reciprocity. And third, because the long tradition of lived experience of the Jewish people is replete with suffering at a collective as well as an individual level. And thus the question of meaning has a social as well as a psychological dimension. And finally, because the entire argument behind this Jewish view of suffering is that the social welfare and charity and medicine and science are what you need to respond to suffering. And they're an act of justice. Science is an act of justice, a response to the human, the argument of the human hand, representing technology, against an unjust and as yet unredeemed and darkened world. Now, the bulk of the paper goes through a long, detailed, and academic discussion about the history of suffering in Jewish texts. The view of suffering and its role in the medical process is one way the Jewish texts take account of a core problem in religion, as we've seen. So what is it? It's that a powerful and compassionate and just God yet allows innocents to suffer, again, both individually and collectively. So Judaism argues for several answers to this problem. So some philosophical texts suggest that suffering is merely a characteristic of physical existence, all physical existence. Some say that individual suffering can only be understood as a kind of alienation or an Augustine kind of privation of the good. This also appears in Jewish texts. It's a turning away in the sense that Buber will later talk about. It's a refusal of the ethical command for Emmanuel Levinas, a command that's made by every suffering person. So if a person is ill and they're suffering, they're commanding a response from you, the world, from you, the healer, and if you don't do it, that's where the suffering comes in. What's stressed in this kind of tradition is while physical pain is part of the mere physicality of creaturely existence, suffering occurs when pain does not evoke a response in fellow humans. In this sense, suffering is a result of simple human failure. Every suffering person creates an interruption and thus a chance for the enactment of this central duty. Now, the tension between the idea that sin results in suffering and that suffering is independent of sin, both of which are in their text, but it's linked to human behavior, is not only a condition in which response arises in the classic texts. In two key biblical texts, Abraham bargains for the salvation of Sodom, and in debates, and Job debates with his friends who want to make a facile link between sin and suffering. And so in both cases, both traditions are apparent. The idea of connection between sin and suffering is raised, but both in Job and in Abraham, it's left unresolved. There's no answer to it in those texts. And the rabbinic text, like the one we just read from the Gemara, in which the idea that suffering is an affliction of love is put forward, and then it's strongly debated, and then strongly refuted, going back and forth. Is it not? Is it, or is it? Now, there's three people that, when you think about Jews and suffering, I'm going to look briefly at three men. Sorry, there's no women here. I'm doing my best. The first one is Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. His dates are 1772 to 1810. He lived within a circle of devotees. He was the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, a Hasidic tradition, the founder of modern Hasidism. And he travels around widely in early modernity in the sale of the Jewish Pale of Settlement, and then goes to Israel, and then goes back to Breslov in the Ukraine, where he settles and establishes a large tradition. What's interesting about Nachman of Breslov is that he suffers from both clinical depression and the death of his young son. And he has a teaching that is still practiced today by Bratslávers. Whether you are rich or whether you are poor, you cannot avoid pain. The world is filled with pain and suffering, and there is no escape. No matter who you are, you will find the world abounds with real suffering and pain, and there is no escape, except in the Torah. Now here it's important to notice, while pious Jews understood suffering as inevitable and was not welcomed, nor in any sense was one passive when suffering, they were, because you went to a doctor, but the key thing was, the only recourse was the study of Torah. No solutions, the argument of Torah. For Franz Rosenzweig, 1886, 1929, core Jewish philosopher, he suffered from ALS, and as he was dying, thought a lot about what it meant to suffer. Suffering, he said, is not a distinctive experience to be theorized, apart from the essential human condition. His condition, or the condition of every son who loses his father, which he did. Writing after his father's death, he speaks of the inherent and essential place of suffering. It is true that every loss makes us more familiar with our own death, but none can bring me closer to it. None has the power to turn me out of the house of life. In spite of all losses, I still retain myself with the unfathomable and continually surprising store of tasks that each new day brings. And each loss, by making me more familiar with death, makes me more ready for life. The less I fear death, indeed, the more I love it, the more freely I can live. That is to say, the more I cease to expect happiness on this earth. If you should feel the despair of having nothing more to lose, remember what I just told you. It is only then that the perfect life commences, the perfect freedom to do and suffer anything. And you turn to life because that's the freedom to do and suffer anything. Writing of his own physical condition, as he lies slowly and terribly dying of ALS, he notes the same ordinariness of suffering. Replying to a letter of sympathy from a follower, he notes, "The words pain and suffering which you use seem quite odd to me. A condition into one in which one has slithered gradually, my ALS, and consequently gotten used to, is not suffering, but simply a condition that leaves room for joy and for suffering like any other." For Emanuel Levinas, 1906 to 1995, my main squeeze in Jewish philosophy, the issues of suffering and its meaning are key to understanding why Judaism is a religion for adults. In two essays about the tragic blunder that links human suffering to God's judgment, he reflects on the horror of the Shoah, the Holocaust. Levinas begins his essay, Loving Torah More Than God, by alluding to an essay that was purported to be, he knew it's not really real, it's a letter written in the last flames of the Warsaw Ghetto by a desperate Yossel ben Yossel Rachafov, a resistance fighter who has just lost his entire family, a wife and 6 children, as well as all of his compatriots, including, just before he writes the letter, a 5-year-old boy who lies beside him dying, as he writes. Now, the letter is a fiction, which Levinas knows, but understands it as presenting an honest but fictive account of the actual events of the Warsaw Ghetto, in which everyone who has survived, like himself, he was a victim of the Holocaust, recognizes his own life in astonishment. Yossel ben Yossel, after his account of his losses, still believes in the Torah of God, in the law, in justice, and duties commanded by a God who is entirely absent and may even be the God of the Nazis. It's a problem. Here's theology. How should a Jew reflect on this narrative, Levinas asks the reader. For Levinas, the correct way to understand the suffering described so precisely and starkly begins to decouple the meaning of cause and effect, of the illusion of control from the experience of suffering. Suffering is the God of an adult, argues Levinas, manifests himself precisely in the emptiness, in the non-causality of the sky. There is no simple answer to the suffering of innocent ones, surely not that it is deserved or an expiation. Indeed, perceiving the existential absence of a God in the sky who allows prizes and sanctions is the first step in a fully adult religious life. A God who conceals his face, he writes. I think this is neither a theologian's abstraction nor a poetic image. It is the hour when the just person has nowhere to go in the outside world, when no institution affords him protection, when even the comforting sense of the divine presence experienced in a childlike person's piety is withdrawn, when the only victory available to the individual lies in his conscience, which necessarily means lies in suffering. This is the specific Jewish meaning of suffering, one that never takes on the quality of a mystical expiation for the sins of the world, the condition in which victims find themselves in a disordered world, a chaotic world. That is to say, in a world where goodness does not succeed in being victorious. That is suffering. Suffering reveals a God, while refusing to manifest himself in any way as help, directs his appeal to the full maturity of the integrally responsible person. Levinas recalls for us the link between suffering and justice is only met by a lived and concrete adult religious life. Like Nachman, Levinas asserts that living as a Jew means understanding the ultimate job of communal response, that everyone is responsible for everyone, and that one's fate is tied to the fate of each other's. The suffering of the just for a justice which is without triumph is lived concretely as Judaism. Now, a key part of such a life is the continual story of the paradoxical texts themselves. God is not incarnate, and suffering is not the key to meaning. The characteristic features of Judaism, the relationship between God and the human person, is not an emotional communion with the context of the love of an incarnate God, but a relationship between minds that is mediated by teaching, by the Torah. The guarantee that there is a living God in our midst is precisely a word of God that is not incarnate. Trust in a God who does not reveal himself through any worldly authority can rest only on inner clarity and the quality of teaching. Now, note this theme put forth throughout Jewish history, that God is unrevealed, but the Torah is revealed. The capacity for study and teaching and the performance of the law is the response, and the only one that's possible for adults. So we live a generation later, but still in the long shadow of Jewish history. The tradition within Jewish thought allows us to understand how different theologies and different histories lead to different responses to suffering in contemporary medical decision-making. But how would this really work out in clinical practice? So let's go back to that story, which we began. So what is happening in this long and complex text? What do you think? Any thoughts about it? Anyone? Come on. You're smart, you're theologians and scientists. Okay, I'll walk you through it, okay? Existential, right, grief.
It's about the grief of each and every person.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the altruism. Each one helps the other at different moments in their life.
Very good. Very good. See, you're a good Talmudic scholar already. See, one text. What's happening in this long, complicated midrash? We're introduced to an unnamed teacher, a Tana, which means an authority of the teaching of the Mishnah, which is a very early layer of the Gemara. We're in Tiberias, we're in Palestine, we're in the Roman Empire, and the culture of Rome is everywhere, as dominant and as oppressive as the punishing heat of the Jordan Valley. The talk is turned in the house of study, the Bet Midrash, as described in the Talmud, the house of study, literally, to the relationship between suffering and meaning. It's a hot day. The claim is made that the three most critical and enduring veracities in a Jew's life amid this oppressive chaos of Roman occupation are the Torah, the land, and the world to come. And they're related to each other because they're given only after punishments. In the wordplay, that is the serious business of the Talmud, it's a language game, they make that point by finding 3 times the word chastisements and used in linkage with 3 different things. The Tana, leading the discussion, makes an assured statement. If a man studies Torah and he does acts of charity, his sins are forgiven him. Even if the man's sins have been so great, he implies, that his children have died as a result of them. The text insinuates this, and that's his Rabbi Eliezer's meaning, or at least Rabbi Yohanan, his student, takes the meaning this way. Enter Yohanan, who will become a central figure in rabbinic texts. The compiler of the Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud, the intellectual leader of the Jerusalem community. He is noted always to be unbearded, very rare in the Talmud, and he is the intellectual leader and always wins the debates. And he is the most perfectly beautiful man in the rabbinic imagination. He is seen as like this utterly beautiful man, bearded, men fall in love with him, all sorts of drama. It's a very tender beauty. It's sort of a famously womanish beauty in the Talmud. It is so striking that once Yohanan is bathing naked in the Jordan River, and he's pursued by Resh Lakish, who takes him for a woman as a sexual contest. Resh Lakish is serving the Romans, right? His beauty is compared to a freshly minted silver vase filled with red roses, the sun striking the silver, shadows playing across the flowers, a rich and gorgeous image of female beauty. So think of Georgia O'Keeffe here. Yohanan is a student of the Tana we met, and we're told he's a very obedient student, a very careful student. He's an orphan. He's raised by his grandfather, and he's taken to the house of study as a child. He states in another section of the Talmud that every word of the Mishnah is absolute and has the same status as Mosaic law. The tablets have it down. But here, listen to him disagree. Here he has the text of his own life. Literally, as it will turn out, that he wears the text of his own life on his body. He's marked by it. He has had 10 sons, and one by one by one, they have all died. And he buries every single one, we're told. Yohanan answers steadily back to his teacher, "How do you know anything about the father who digs the hole in the earth and shovel by shovel buries his children there? How can you know this?" Another unnamed older teacher replies, "Well, look, here's the proof text. The parallel language is just the same." And the Tanakama, that elder, shows that this trick of the word game binds the literal moral universes together. But Yohanan, this time, still steadily objects. Illness and the loss of children, these are not the chastisements of love. Flat statement. The elders argue back against him. One thinks of Job's friends here. But it has been taught, they say. The Torah, the text. The mark of illness, they say. It's an altar of atonement, meaning that the bearer of illness is marked by his suffering and his redemption, his pain, and it's his penance. Perhaps his own illness is, says Yohanan, perhaps the ill body is that altar of atonement, the place of sacrifice and amends. Remember, these are Jews who've lost the actual place of atonement, the temple. But the illness, he says, that is not the condemnation of a loving God. How can that be? And then the argument suddenly stops and shifts in an attempt to use language to evolve this tension that's slowly building in the scene where the devoted, passive, pretty student is taking on the elders of the Bet Midrash. It's a shocking moment. The elder, or perhaps another voice, argues, let me put it this way, if you like. And he offers to compromise with Yohanan. The teachings of the Mishnah will be held in the exile community in Babylonia. But here in Palestine, where you live, in the Beit Midrash of everybody who knows Yohanan and his terrible personal tragedy, will follow his opinion, and we won't challenge it. Or, if you like, we can say, continues another voice, another compromiser, we can say the Mishnah refers to hidden illness, and Yohanan is referring to the horrific catastrophe of visible illness that his children had. But what about the children? What will you say about that, says another voice in the text. Maybe it's the editor, maybe it's Yohanan's friend. The text insists we cannot turn away from the original problem. How can the death of children be possibly understood as having anything to do with a reprimand of love from God? Can it even be said neutrally, without moral resonance, that he had children and they just died? There's a silence, and then someone speaks up. And Amora, a teacher, says later, if a man studies Torah, and if he does acts of charity, his sins are forgiven him, even if a man's sins have been so great that his children, he says, the guy who speaks up is actually a generation, 100 years later, after the original argument. But in the Talmud, everyone's in the same room. You, the readers, all the rabbis, everybody's there. So it's 100 years later, but he breaks in. But the debate is not finished. Remember our teacher himself saying, "This is the bone of my 10th son"? And that just stops the debate, that bone. The image of Rabbi Yohanan with the bones of his last lost baby son carried in his pocket, held in his hands as he argues about the laws of healing. And here the narrative breaks off. And suddenly we're in another scene, in the midst of the actions of healing that have occurred decades and decades before this argument. We're in a sick room, and we see Yohanan now working as a healer. He is at the bedside of Rabbi Chaya ben Abba, another one of his old teachers, perhaps the unnamed one who has argued with him in the earlier passage. Yohanan asks his patient about the meaning of his sufferings. Are they welcome, he asks his teacher. It seems to be a kind of informed consent negotiation. Do you want my intervention, or do you prefer I do not touch you and you just suffer? And the sick man is clear, he wants the intervention. The illness is not bearable, nor is he learning anything of spiritual value. No, not the illness, not the suffering, not any possible spiritual reward for my bearing of them. And at that, Yohanan gives him his hand, the rabbinic symbol for technology, but also for an actual hand, and he raises him from the bed, presumably having cured him. Stem cell research, whatever. But the scene shifts again, and this time, Yohanan's in bed, and he's ill, and he's vulnerable, and another teacher, his great friend, the healer Hanina, came to visit him. What is not said is also important. Hanina and Yohanan have had a fight so profound that Yohanan has left the Sepphoris, where he studied as one of his Hanina's pupil, to found an academy in Tiberias all by himself. And later in the story of this deep and complex friendship, things will reverse again, and Hanina will die just as Yohanan hurries to his bedside, and he will mourn his teacher as a son mourns his father, ripping his clothes, that all the 13 clothes he wears. But first, before we get to that, this story of Yohanan. But of course, anyone who's reading it knows the whole backstory, right? This is Yohanan who is ill, and he's the ill healer, and Hanina the one to heal. And the exact same question is asked. Tell me, is there meaning, goodness, and welcome in illness? And the answer is exactly the same as well, no. And the act of hand-to-hand healing is accomplished, and he raises it from his bed. But a voice interrupts. Wait a minute, that's Yohanan, isn't he the great healer? Didn't he just heal that other guy a paragraph ago? And the answer is given from someplace, but now he's imprisoned by his illness, and he cannot free himself without this help, without both the question being asked of meaning and the human gesture of friendship, the embodied connection, and the tangible technical response. Now there's more. There's another scene. Rabbi Eliezer is now in the bed. He is a student of both Hanina and of Yohanan. And Eliezer is the one who has disappointed Yohanan in the past. He's now ill. Yohanan is now well again, and he's a healer again. The room is dark, and it is a bleak time. There is a terrible tragedy for society. They're driven from Yavna, where they had gone after the destruction of the temple, by further Roman oppression. And in Babylonia, the Zoroastrians have seized power, endangering the community there. The lighting of fires, including the kindling of the Shabbat candles, is forbidden by the Zoroastrians and must be done secretly. It's a dark time for Yohanan as well, because he's a failed healer. And into this darkness, Yohanan lifts his arm from his scholar's cloak, from his 13 garments, and he holds it up. And suddenly it fills the darkness with light. And when the younger man sees this, he begins to cry. Yohanan, the healer, asks, why? Is it regret that you haven't studied enough, my student? Is it poverty, or it's that you haven't had children? He attempts to comfort him. What matters is intention, not quantity. Wealth isn't important. Many people are poor. And finally, and startlingly, he takes that shining hand from the air and he puts it into his pocket. And he takes out that last bone from his dead son, his youngest son, the trump card of loss itself. Some people translate this bone as the tooth of his baby son. Perhaps the bone imagery is too stark. Or perhaps they really do mean the tooth. And I, the feminist scholar, imagine this, that he carries the baby tooth of his last baby boy. But Eliezer is not crying for himself. He's crying for the whole tragic journey of mortality itself. He is struck by the understanding that he and all those lost children, and finally even the beautiful, sad, gifted teacher, the very image of rabbinic power, the wounded healer, filled with the light of faith in the midst of darkness, even that will be lost. And whenever I read that sentence, I think of Gerald Manley Hopkins, of course. It is Margaret that I mourn for. I'm weeping, he says, on your account, on the account of all that beauty that is going to rot in the earth. And we're back to burial, to the red clay of the Galilee, piled shovel by shovel over the graves that have been theorized at the beginning of the section. For this, Yohanan tells the patient, for mortality itself, for seeing the fate of both of you, you surely are right. You have a reason for existential grief beyond that I can talk you out of. And then the healer and his patient sit in the room, and they weep together. The reversal of self and other, healer and patient, finally accomplished. After a while, the ritualized question and the ritualized response, I find no meaning in this, I want rescue. And the healer, not with incantations and not with potions, though both, by the way, are fully available as textual strategies, and they've always been used in the Talmud by Hanina and other rabbinic healers, but he just gives him his hand, which is to say, he gives him the relationship of one embodied mortal self to another, hand to hand, body to body, substitution for you, doctor, could be you, patient, and Jewish thought always reminds us of this. And it seems the story is completed. But we as readers of the story, in this section of the Talmud, Barchot, which means blessings, know more about the characters from another section of the Talmud, Baba Metzia, which the exact same characters reappear. We know the healer Yohanan has once famously refused to heal, and it was a terrible turning away. Yohanan's dearest friend, the man who had surprised him in the river, the soldier Resh Lakish, becomes trained as a student by Yohanan and marries his sister and challenges him in the language games of study. But suddenly there's a disputation, and Yohanan makes fun of Lakish, makes fun of him as a warrior, his warrior past, and perhaps sort of a corrupt warrior past. And Lakish, his brother-in-law, never speaks to him again and becomes gravely and mysteriously ill. And he lies dying, and Lakish's wife, who's of course Yohanan's sister, comes to Yohanan and begs him, visit him, see him, heal him with your gifts and the light with the hands, you're so famous. Engage him in the study of Torah, and that will heal him. But despite her pleas, look at me, see my face, Yohanan does not see her. And he will not look at the face of his friend. And when his friend dies, Yohanan steadily loses his mind, and he wanders around Palestine lost. His colleagues kind of bring him to Eliezer to study with him, but Eliezer is not Lakish and cannot comfort him or heal him, which is to say, he can't argue with him coherently enough. He takes to standing at the gates of the city, Yohanan does, calling out, son of Lakish, my friend, where are you? He becomes so hysterical, so lost, that the rabbis pray for his death, and he dies. And that is the tragic end of Yohanan in that narrative. Note how it's the existential loneliness for him that is fatal. And note how in our other text, it's the opposite. It's the capacity for companionship in suffering, even irredeemable suffering, that allows healing to occur and pain to be mitigated. Reading the two stories together, as one can assume Jews and now you have done since the Talmud was codified in 600, Common Era, presents sort of a meta-argument over the textual argument, as if several people crowded into the room of the tale and memory and community enter the narrative all at once. But even the logic of the text looks odd. The tale is weird. It's repeated 3 times. Perhaps there's been some mistake, like a textual problem, right? But since the same story, like in Genesis, is told in different ways, it suggests the writer of the text had got it wrong. Didn't know what was the real story, and so just left all the versions in the last draft. But I don't understand it that way, and I don't think you should either. In fact, I think the whole point of the story is the exactness of the odd retelling of the same scene and the peculiarities of the way that the figure in bed switches from being the person of Yonahan to the persons of his teacher and then his student. This reversal then not only teaches us about the nature of mortality, will happen to everybody, the haunting question that Eliezer will raise in the last little bit of the story, but it also serves as a commentary on the first premise, the relationship between suffering and meaning and one's just deserts, because everybody's in bed. Through it all, the healer, teacher, carries this white bone, the tangible symbol of his loss itself. Now we're introduced to this bone, which is to say the blood and the body and the sacrifice in the first paragraph. And we see it then re-emerge at the end. Hence, for the entire narrative, if you're like me, that bone's in your head, grounding us in the physicality of the grief. And in this sense that allows Yohanan to make his point, it's not illness, it's not loss that allows for redemption, it's the responsive act of healing that allows for redemption. It's not reading too much into the language, I think, to make this claim. The story, like all stories in the Talmud, is left open. The rabbinic discussion is interrupted over and over, and then interrupted by this action itself. And here we see the struggle to decide what is the meaning of the words left to us by the Academy. But unlike the Greek symposium, the conversation, while important, is always interrupted. It's always stopped by action. It's stopped by the gesture of healing, by the gesture of weeping, which is, of course, for the rabbis of the Talmud, primarily another sort of conversation, the talk with the ill person. And thus, when the classic trust gesture of equality and friendship is made, only then can the healing work. The next story of our section, in the Talmud, remember how it pulled us deeper into the problem. For here suddenly the hero of our story is himself ill, marked by atonement and suffering, and in this sense the healing is conversive, as if reversed, as if having to be turned around. And the word in Hebrew for turned around is tshuva, which also means repentance. It's to change course. This time you see Yohanan answering the questions that he has been asked and will ask of the other. He's the object of the healing ritual. He is given to and he takes. It's this ability to reverse that lies at the heart of every healing act. Unlike a medical dictum that teaches that the ill are different from us, to be pitied, to bear some complex burden for us, or to be an object in our moral world, the ill are us in this text. Each of us is a participant. And we are interrupted ourselves by illness and by suffering, the humanness that we all share. And that's the essential part of knowing how to heal. And let's see, healing always and truthfully and fully. These are the bones of my dead, begins the act of healing by telling the truth. Healing always telling truthfully and fully. Here, the connection between truthfulness to the other and truthfulness about obligation, an obligation taken on fully and taken on faith. But truth is only the first act of healing. Let us return to the problem of expiation. Here, the rabbis of the Talmud struggled with a real crisis. Perhaps most critically, the rabbis most involved in the acts of healing. Why? Because when there was a temple, the second temple, and before, when they had that, disease, especially leprosy, alluded to in the first part of the argument, had clear biblical therapeutic interventions. The leper was required to bring an animal sacrifice to the real altar of atonement, and the blood of the slain animal was used to cleanse the affected place of leprosy. The healers, the priests, who become the rabbis, had elaborate interventions and rituals for a practice of healing. The Jews controlled the state then, and so the entire civic, theopolitical system could function for quarantine, for reentry, and for the explanation of illness. But in the darkness of Roman rule, where the Jews were unarmed, or rather, they had nothing but their own bright arms, their own hands, the entire system of healing was disrupted. The narrative flow of the biblical edict, physical act, and spiritual redemption utterly destroyed. So what will be done? If the priest could not come sweeping into your house, hands full of birds and cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet, and light them into a sweet bright fire, and clean the walls with blood, and wipe the wings of the birds with blood, and then set them free out of the windows and doors, as is beautifully described in Leviticus, what can the healer actually do? If the healing priest cannot slaughter the goat and place his hands in its blood and wipe the blood on your right ear, your right hand, and your right foot, and then drip the healing oil on your right ear, your right hand, and your right foot, what can really be done? If you cannot strip off your blood-soaked garments, all of you at the ritual, and if the healed one and the healer cannot go out to the great baths, and then to the temple again with noise and gladness in the songs of the Levites, the gold of the gates and the mountain sun, what could possibly replace this? And these quiet healer texts tell us what you do in exile. You must come into a dark and desperate room, and you must sit, and you must listen to the voice of the other in need. And when the other asks for truth about death, you must tell him. And in this act, you must seek justice. What you are obliged to be as a healer is the one who can just hear the voice of the one who is vulnerable. And if you then can, then the loss of might and state power will not disrupt that which is central to the world, the intimate and daily acts of justice on which the world in Judaism depends. For it is justice, tzedakah, which has the dual meaning in Hebrew of both social justice and charity. The other is not an event for you, a commodity for you, nor a job for you. It is a challenge because the other is you, as you, after all, are the one that demands and sees the tragedy of limits and then allows for the phronesis of healing. The sickened world and the sickness of alienation and the dark room of the unfair and incomprehensible fate of illness, it will be lit up by your presence, your very body, in all of its limits and all of its light. These texts of justice cannot be unhitched from the rabbinic understanding of healing. For the commandment is a lamp, our text taught us, and the teaching is light, and the reproofs of suffering are the way of light. If the commandments are the lamp, and if teaching the commandments is the light that radiates from it, and suffering is the way of the world, then in this story that we've read together, in the life without the temple, the human healer who enacts the commandment literally becomes a lamp. His body is filled with light, transformed, thus linking the continuous text together as one whole. The lamp appears and the bone appears, the lamp and the bone appear again. David Hartman, the philosopher of Judaism, explains, healing stands in for the entire enterprise of human responsibility. In an unjust world then, and certainly now, in which a great deal of what reads as illness and suffering is really caused by indifference and greed and injustice. In an unjust world, the gesture of medicine and of healing might be the essential gesture of justice itself. How do we answer for the darkness of leprosy, which of course in the Torah biblical period clearly meant an illness of a far different sort, an illness of the soul, an illness of a society or of a house? And we answer now with a ritual of a far different sort, the hand in the hand of the other. The light of sheer beauty transformed into the warmth of the hand at the end of the story. And the blood that is streaked everywhere, and the blood of the healer in the temple, the sacrifice of the animal, is now transformed into the sacrifice of the self to the other. And in this case, it's also the way that being a father and a teacher has for Yohanan meant loss of son and of student and of brother. For Levinas, the utter chaos of the world is mirrored by the utter enormity of our responsibility. Let me say that again because it's critical for thinking about suffering in Judaism. The utter chaos of the dark world is mirrored by the utter enormity of our responsibility. Reading Levinas, I think a lot about our dilemmas in modern bioethics. Should the healer stand outside the case, or should she not use everything in her power to alleviate suffering? Can she be overwhelmed by the context, the tragedy, or the helplessness that leaves not a corner of the sensible world intact? Is she not to be marked and not to think of her body and the body of the patient as a way fundamentally interchangeable? Yohanan the healer is as marked by the blood as by the lost altar of the temple. He is the healer and he's not the ill one, but that's the altar of atonement, and it is the act of healing. In physical and tangible ways, it is the act of healing that restores order and justice to the world. And we, hence, are restored to the first claim that Yohanan has made. It is the acts of tzedakah, justice, that heal the world. Justice that will stand in instead of the temple and the system of sacrifice in return. I will grant you that Torah and acts of charity can absolve sin, he tells us. For it is written, by mercy and truth, inequity is expiated. Mercy is acts of charity, he says. For it is said, he that follows after righteousness and mercy finds life and prosperity and honor. In the Yom Kippur liturgy, three things replace the temple sacrifice and mediate the harshness of the sentences of the year to come. Tshuva, which means repentance or return. For this account, let's say reversal into the other. Tzedakah, charity and hence justice. And tefillah, prayer. Healing is at its heart reversal. It is justice. It is return. It is charity. And for the rabbis, perhaps prayer is that which allows us to first hear the cry of the one in need. For the Jewish tradition argues that evil is not inherent, nor sin an inevitable fate, nor suffering is the punishment for frail and flawed human choices. But the problem is largely about what to do next, and next, and next after that. What do you do to repair the rupture of the communal memory? How do you pass on truthful talk? In this essay, I've argued that the turn to Torah and duty and healing is the correct response to suffering. I've made the claim that whenever the point is made that links the suffering of illness to sin or to redemption, there is another voice that refutes the idea, and strongly. That it is not only true in the Talmudic passage, but it's also embedded in the biblical tradition, when the idea that sin leads to suffering is put in the mouth of Job's stupid friends. In the rabbinic tradition, and the texts of medieval and modern Jewish thought, from Hasidic masters like Nachum of Bratslav to academic philosophers like Levinas alike. Suffering argues this very strong voice within Jewish tradition needs not to be explained in terms of God's plan, nor offered up as mimetic action, nor celebrated, never sought. It is to be opposed. The correct response to suffering is to ask how to find life in the middle of death, healing in the dark room of death, to rise again from the dark, understanding that mortality cannot be defeated even by the very best medicine, but must be risen from all the same. It is about what to do and how to carry on in the face of this knowledge. In this text that we read together, the suggestion is made by the structure of the story itself and by the simple gestures across a bed 2,000 years and rivers and oceans away, remembered and carried like the beloved's white bone. We only understand the healer after we've seen him at work, after we've heard him and allowed him to hear the ones he's healing, after the discursive universe and thus the moral world is set right by simple acts of goodness. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Very helpful. Questions?
Thanks very much. I really like this presentation of redemption as a this worldly kind of thing. What you've summarized is not so much God versus evil, but humanity versus chaos, and that's kind of cool.
Exactly, yeah.
So my question, though, has to do then with these three things that God has given us: the land, Torah, and the world to come.
Right.
Because that third thing stands a bit in contrast, then, at least by my very naive hearing, what you've presented is, like I said, not God versus evil, but humanity versus chaos, and yet one of these great things is the world to come, which actually does sound a bit otherworldly, if you'll pardon my saying the obvious. So what does this mean, the world to come?
Well, it's a setup, right? Because, and it's in the world of the reader of the Talmud, it's an obvious setup because they're out of the land. They don't have the land, right? So it's what you can tell that it's a bit of it's an ironic statement, not a real statement, not a claim, because that it's false, that it's hollow. And this text is about the hollowness of this. We don't have the land. We have the Torah, but we don't have the land, and I don't know about the word to come, or even how to get there. And the Talmud is a tragic discussion at a time that moves from the Mishnah 200 years before the temple is destroyed to 400 later years of textual discussion of just entrapment and colonialization and occupation. So that's an ironic statement that's immediately refuted, right? So Yohanan is sitting there, and up until this point, he's never challenged his teachers. right? But his teacher is just said something really, that the trick is it's sort of stupid, it's sort of ironic. Because he's saying, oh, it's all good, we have the land and Torah and the world to come, and yet they sort of don't. So maybe the world to come is this world. The world that's come often means like the next day, or the world we leave for our children. It doesn't mean heaven in the rabbinic context. So it's an interesting, or it's maybe collective redemption, but you can tell that it's kind of a dumb statement because they don't have the land, which is when you should go, oh, what is he saying that for, as you're reading along, right? And that's why Yohanan refutes it. That's why it's an argument. Jews think through things with arguing. So they get to the end of it, and you can see how far the text moves you through this story. It's sort of bleak, I'm sorry.
Elaine, right down the front here. Just wait for the mic. It'll come. It'll come. Here we are.
I don't have so much a question as a clarification. You mentioned in the very beginning that there is a distinctiveness in Jewish thought on suffering with relationship to community of memory.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a concept that we use quite a bit in sociology.
Right.
And I wondered if you could just talk a bit, you sort of said that in passing, but I found it so much of your talk had to do with suffering realized through the community.
Right.
And I just found that, I'm sort of sitting here thinking about it and thinking about how I could apply it more widely as a concept in other kinds of social phenomenon and spaces.
Well, there's so much to say about memory.
So much.
So let me just start saying things and stop me when I get to me.
Yeah.
The Talmud is a memory machine, right? Because in the Talmud, like what year is it when you're in this discussion, right? Sort of we know they're in Tiberias in Palestine, but then some guy comes in. You remember the guy who comes in who's 100 years later? Like as if he's in the room with them, and then I'm in the room with them, and so the time is, so it takes you back through. And remember how I said that anyone reading it, any knowledgeable reader would know the backstory of this tragedy of Yohanan and Resh Lakish, right? So it's sort of like, I don't know what the equivalent is in other countries, but the American TV show Friends, right? Popular American television shows. A lot of action happens in the television that you see, but then they refer back to their years together in high school. See, I found a cultural metaphor that sort of makes sense. And so I feel like I know what they were doing in high school. When I see them interacting, in my head is the story, right? And so that's what happens in the Talmud, right? Because you know all the characters, and you know their stories and who's the student of who, and so you carry it with you. So that's what makes this story so terrible, because here he's such a good healer, but with his brother-in-law, he failed horribly. So he's a failed healer, and yet in this text he's really gets it right, and so that's why. So that in some sense you have to always carry in your head the temple, the Sinai, the golden calf, and they give you devices because they have citations like hyperlinks. Like they'll quote like 3 words of a psalm, and then you know the whole rest of the psalm. So it acts as a memory device. That's one thing. The second thing is that Jews can't own land from this time forward until late modernity, like the world that we're in, like capitalism. So Jews can't have land, and all they can have is this book, and all they can have is the memory of another thing. So in daily prayer, you pray for the restoration of animal sacrifice, right? I mean, it's very weird, but you keep, so that the memory keeps forward. And obviously, for anyone doing Jewish bioethics in our generation, carries with us the legacy of the Nazis and the way they used medicine, and the legacy of the Jewish catastrophe. And you can't ever, it creates a sort of wariness. It's called the shadow of history. There's a term for it in bioethics, the shadow of history. Then you don't have to keep saying Nazi all the time. So that's what that means. So that you carry that memory. So the carrying of the story is the work of the Jew, to carry the story all the way through history and keep recalling it. So it's an interesting, so that's how it works. Yeah.
Anthony, and then Hilary.
Laurie, thank you. Isn't there also another story within the Jewish history which you could say gives you another way to deal with the situation? This is our friend Moses. He sticks his hand into his bosom and pulls it out covered in leprosy. But rather than seeing it as a source of suffering, he sees it as a paradox. And instead of railing at God and saying, I've got a problem here, his attitude is different. He's basically turns to God and says, okay, show me why this is not a problem. And then God says, well, stick your hand back in your bosom. He pulls it out, and the leprosy is no longer there. So you've got lots of different instances within Jewish tradition and history of how to deal with issues. Why would you not pick that one, which makes, to my sense, and certainly I use in my own healing practice, to say to people, don't bow down and worship error and suffering. Turn to God and say, show me why this is not a problem. Isn't that also a legitimate way of dealing with it?
We don't use Moses as a role model for much, certainly not parenting, right? So there's a lot of things that goes on with Moses, and sometimes Moses is a lying prophet. You know, God tells him one thing and he tells the people something totally else. So it's a complicated thing to draw lessons, moral lessons from that moment. Because a few pages later, his sister and brother come to him to criticize him, and his sister is stricken with leprosy, and he prays to God for it to go away, and it does. So it's a very different, same leprosy. So it's very unclear what leprosy means, how much is a spiritual catastrophe, how much is depression. Moses is sort of an emotional mess through most of his, he's our teacher, but Moshe Rabbeinu is a teacher. But he's also sort of, he's like not like stable in much of his leadership style, right? He gets so angry and he's so violent, and that actually his violence, the striking of the rock is a metaphor, his capacity to get so angry so quickly and just lose it. He starts by striking an Egyptian, and he ends by striking a rock, and in between. And so we often don't use biblical figures. We talk about them, but we can't say just exactly like it is. So most of Rabbinic Judaism then refracts his actions into a version that can be used as a moral language game, like we said. So that's why you'll see when Jews read Scripture, will always go back to the rabbinic normative explanation, because the descriptive aspect of ethics is in one sense mediated by the normative aspect of the rabbinic decision making. But it's a beautiful passage, and you could do some interesting work on that and see what did rabbis think of that moment. You could look at the Midrash Rabbah and say, what do they think of that? What does it mean for them? But they understand that illness, this leprosy, is horribly serious, and people will die, and they can't be near the camp. And there's something they're very ultimate about having leprosy in the biblical story.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Early on in your talk, you just referred sort of almost in passing to say that the hand in the healing refers to technology. And of course, obviously, that's in the modern context.
Yes.
But I suppose I was wondering how it's been interpreted over the passage of time. Has it always been interpreted as some form of medical or healing invention, or was it ever interpreted as just a sort of literally an act of miraculous healing, like Jesus, stories in the Gospels of Jesus holding people's hands and they are healed?
Yeah. It's such a beautiful question. Because then there's Elisha, one of my favorite stories. Elisha just kind of lies down on somebody, and Elisha's no saint himself. He kills children right after that. He kills children for laughing at him, destroys them. So it's a very complicated sense of what's. Nobody comes off as actually when you read the New Testament, the different thing is that Jesus is always good. There's no character like that in Hebrew Scripture, or really in the Talmud, right? It's the very interesting different thing about what a miracle is, what healing is. So healing is a mess here in this story, right? And now how different the miracle of his hand, which somehow takes the light of Torah into it, how different that is from how Jesus heals. Because, in a divine way, right? So Reshkiah is like this flawed guy. There's another piece about this that's interesting. In another section of the Talmud, there's a man selling potions. And in the language of the Talmud, the potions work. Magic potions, guy in the marketplace, he's come in, he's magic potions, and he thinks there's one that will postpone aging. And so one of the rabbis says, well, I want that. And he trundles out to the marketplace. And he says, I want to buy some of that good stuff you got. And the guy looks at him and says, this isn't for you. You're a rabbi. You're a teacher. You're supposed to be doing something else about healing. something like this, like the Johann thing. And so he rejects it. So that's a text against the use of potions. And there's a long series of texts about magic. Can you use a magic? Can you use, if you just use your words, that's permitted. Your hands, that's permitted. If you have to make something or have like devices, that's not permitted. So there's interesting texts where technology is important, and there's the text where the technology of just hand healing is the technology that you want. And the same tension, yes and no tension, both and tension, is of course in the Tower of Babel story, which in the rabbinic text is sometimes interpreted as bad labor behavior. Right? They built a tower and someone died, they bricked them over. And sometimes it's interpreted as technology itself, the hubris of making things. So in Jewish texts, it's very hard to say, here's what we think. That's why I like to focus on one text, do it really deeply, and analyze it, and what is this moment saying? And then, but I do think that this text, the tragedy of this text, and Yohanan and story that goes all the way through this section of the Talmud, is a very important story for normative Judaism. And it's a very troubling story. So, but it's interesting because I think about technology a lot, like how much intervention, it's right, So.
You have another coming.
I didn't quite understand you saying that mind to mind.
That's what Levinas is saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Levinas says it's through the language of the Torah, where you can counter God.
Yeah, but you have these amazing things happening, like when it is constructed.
The Mishkan, yeah.
And coming down on the mountain.
Clouds and stuff, yeah.
Like the mountain shaking.
Yes.
So you have the immanence of God.
Yes, except we don't have it anymore, right? So the age of miracles is over, and the Talmud is very clear about that. In the Talmudic period, sometimes there's texts that say there's no bat kol, there's no voice from heaven. And then you'll find another text that says, the bat kol said. So in the Talmudic period, they still want to hear God's voice, but they don't count on miracles, so the Romans wouldn't have won. Right? And Maimonides says, look, that doesn't happen anymore. And the phrase Maimonides uses is the world pursues its usual course, which is very similar to what you said. We live in what many of the medieval texts say. We live in a world of suffering. That's what it is. God isn't in Levinas is the whole quote, which you'll read, is God's not in the sky like a magician handing out rewards and punishment. That's how children think about God. But an adult Jew should think about God as in the words of the Torah, struggling with the Torah, struggling with the Talmud, because that's all we have is words. And it's a very difficult kind of religiosity, I think. It's very comforting to think of, yourself as accompanied in some intimate way, and as the suffering is having some meaning, or that you learn. People often say we learn something, and this is a bleak text that says, I don't learn anything from this. I don't get anything from this. My sins aren't washed away by the suffering. It's very, very different. And remember, these texts are the same period that Jesus is walking around the same physical area, right? They're contemporaries. So it's a very challenging choice, I think, these texts. Okay.
So to follow that up, does that mean that God is therefore absent?
Hidden in a fundamental. Levinas is a Jewish philosopher. He survives the Holocaust. He is Heidegger's first student. He translates Heidegger into French. He calls Heidegger my father. And then Heidegger won't hide him. Heidegger becomes a Nazi early on, and Levinas is betrayed and joins the French army, which lasts about, a week and a half or something. And then he's captured in the prisoner of war camp. And that's how he spends he writes his books in his head until he gets out. So I totally forgot the question, I'm talking about Levinas, but he believes that God's not in the sky. And that disturbing thing when he says, God, it looks like from most of World War II, it looked like the Lutheran Nazi God was winning. They were on their side. Things were going swimmingly. It was very tragic for him that God doesn't intervene. And then he says, you can't think that God's present in that way because he didn't intervene in history. And so it's he then reconstructs a philosophy in which God is present in the gesture of recognition of the other, which is his whole thing, the face of the other. And that's where you encounter God. And he's an Orthodox Jew. His whole life he's, praying, teaching Judaism. But God's not there's no heaven, there's no system of reward and punishment that we can understand in his philosophy. So, yeah.
Over on the front row here. And I think that might be the last question before we draw for lunch.
Well, I hope I'm going to give you a big opening here. The application of the story to what our technology allows us to do today, what do we need to take from your story?
Here's what I take from the story, and here's why I teach the story. I think how we understand suffering is really important. And I spent a lot of time arguing in the American bioethics debate about the meaning of suffering. And there's a strong voice within American bioethics, Leon Cass, many others, Yul Melander, who thinks that suffering is important because it defines us. And we ought not to imagine a world in which suffering is eliminated. That's a false telos. And if medicine is about the elimination of suffering, medicine's gotten it wrong. Now, that's a Christian idea, in a sense, because how you're redeemed and how you're made whole is by understanding Jesus as Christ, it seems to me, right? That's what I hear from my Christian friends. And the cross is the center of the world, then the cross has to mean that. But for Jews, the center of the world is the Torah. So, so the suffering doesn't have that redemptive meaning. So that's why Jews are very big on trying to eliminate suffering, right? And being very aggressive about it, because this is the world that counts. Because there's not a security about the world to come. So one of my colleagues, Sandra Wheeler, once said to me in a debate about genetic engineering, she said, "Laurie, you're so foolish. You think this world that you see is all that there is. And I believe that there's much more than the world that I see. That there's much more in my life, and there's much more to come." And that's a different belief. And that's what Jews believe, that this world needs to be healed. And how you respond to this chaos is you create a world of justice. Right? Because there's no natural law theory really in Judaism. So the world isn't fair, nature is not beautiful, it's morally neutral, and all that we have is to straighten it out, to repair it, to keep tikkun olam, is this act of healing and justice, human acts of redemption. So it's a very different idea. So in general, this comes to a head in hospitals. Anyone who's a physician knows that if you have religious Filipino nurses and Jewish patients, you have a contrast in how much pain medication you get. And someone has to come in and say, no, they're not offering, there's a very different idea about what's happening here. Many Catholics will think that Jews are too aggressive in their end-of-life care, and that anyone who works in bioethics will hear that story. And it's because, how do you respond to suffering? Is it your priority? What do you do? What about this world versus the next world? And so that's why I try to think about this text. But I love this text, and I think this is an interesting text to highlight the difference. Right? So.
Okay, thank you. I think time has moved on, and we'll finish there. But can you join me in thanking Laurie for...